Sam and Joe went to church one Sunday. Sam knew his way around church. He grew up in the church. As far back as he can remember, he had gone to church with his parents. Sam knew his Bible quite well. He could quote many portions of it from memory. So Sam made his way to the front of the church and sat in the first row. Before the service began, he bowed his head and closed his eyes because he saw his dad do that, and he knew it looked holy. Sam didn't smoke or drink alcohol, or he took pride in his ability to abstain from sex before marriage. We might say Sam was a good guy. As Sam was feeling pleased with himself of how good he was, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Joe walk into the service. What is he doing here? He thought to himself. What right does he have to be in church? What Sam didn't know is that Joe had similar feelings. Joe was thinking to himself, I shouldn't be here in church. I have no right being here. Joe was not a religious guy. He had a reputation of being bad. He had no intention of going to church on this day, but after being thrown out of his home by his live-in girlfriend and excommunicated by his mom, he had nowhere else to turn. He was overcome with how he had made a mess of things. He came into church that Sunday. He had alcohol in his breath from the night before, and an early morning drink that was meant to comfort him did little. So Joe, he slid in the back of the church and sat in the back row. In the same service were two men. Sam, a good guy. Joe, we might say, a bad guy. Two men who had different experiences that day. There was Sam, the good guy, who found an inner satisfaction in being known as a good guy, yet he went home that night far, far from God. And there was Joe, the bad guy, who sat with great shame in his heart, deep lump in his throat, and tears in his eyes. He went home that Sunday very near God. Two men, two different experiences, two different results. Now, that's a contemporary version of the story Jesus told in Luke chapter 18. Luke chapter 18. It's a story of one who missed the point of the other who got it. I have entitled it Good Guy, Bad Guy, because we often have such categories, even if secretly so. Jesus, the masterful storyteller, gave us parables. Now, a parable, I remind you, is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. It's a story that's placed alongside of something else for comparison. They are simply stories that illustrate a spiritual truth. Well, in Luke 18, Jesus describes an unrighteous man as the one who went home right with God, and the righteous man as the one who did not. This is an outrageous story, for it messed with the people and what they believed in that day. And by the end of this story, Jesus commends the kind of person we would condemn, and he condemns the kind of person we would commend. Once again, Jesus turned theology on its head. The wonderful thing about this story in Luke 18 is that we're clued in from the outset why Jesus told it. And so if you're not there, I'd invite you to turn to the Gospel of Luke. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, in chapter 18. Luke chapter 18. It is in Luke chapter 18, verse 9, we are told up front the why behind the story. So look with me at Luke 18, verse 9. It says, to some who were confident of their own righteousness and looked down on everybody else, Jesus told this parable. Now, let's stop there for a moment. I want us to see here the connection between one being confident in his own righteousness and looking down on everybody else. These two descriptions really go together because those who tend to be self-righteous are also those who tend to look down on others. Now, here's the tricky thing. The more we take spiritual matters seriously, now get this, the more we take spiritual matters seriously, the greater we are at risk to look down on others, to pass judgment on people. You say, well, I don't really see myself as judgmental. I don't really do that, do I? Well, I read of a pastor of a church in Texas who never saw himself as a judgmental person. So he tried this experiment. For a whole week, he kept track of his judgments about other people. And here's what he discovered. He says, first of all, judging others is fun. Judging others is fun. Judging others makes you feel good. He says, I judge my daughter for being moody, which especially bothers me when I'm being moody. But of course, I have good reason. I watch the news and I condemn those idiotic people who do such things. Most reality TV shows are full of people I can judge as sinful, ignorant, stupid, arrogant, or childish. I get in my car and drive and I find a host of inept drivers who should have flunked their driving test. And I throw in a little condemnation on our Department of Motor Vehicles for good measure. At the store, I complain to myself about the lack of organization that makes it impossible to find what I'm looking for, all the while being tortured by the music being played in the background. Who picks that music anyway? He says, I stand in the shortest line, which I judge is way too long, because look, people, it says 10 items or less, and I count more than that in your baskets. What's wrong with you people? And why can't that teenage cashier focus and work so we can get out of here? And what in the world is she wearing? In conclusion, he says this. Judging is our favorite pastime if we're honest, but we're not. We're great at judging the world around us by standards we would highly resent being held to. True? Have you ever noticed how much pleasure there is in passing judgments on others? I mean, honestly, don't we enjoy it more than seems reasonable? Why? Why are we so readily look down on others? Why are we so quick to criticize? I mean, we need to be honest. It's so that I can feel better about myself. It is, as Haddon Robinson put it, if I pull your house down, my house stands taller. Well, Jesus goes after that attitude in today's story. Jesus presses in on the kind of religion that is acceptable to him. He exposes the attitude and motives of the heart. He cuts through the chase of the externals that we're often more concerned with than true spirituality that comes from within. And Jesus answers the question, really the question on the table is this: how is one made right with God? So Jesus tells the story. In verse 10, Jesus says, 2 men, Sam and Joe, went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Well, let's first look at the good guy. The good guy. Jesus tells us that one of the men who entered the temple that day was a Pharisee. Now, when we hear the word Pharisee, like Pavlov's dogs, we are conditioned to react a certain way. We think of all Pharisees as evil. It has a bad connotation for us, but not so in that day. Pharisees were looked upon favorably in that society. In the hearer's mind, a Pharisee was a regular church attender. He knew his Bible. He was the first one to write out a check to meet a need. He was a good guy, a holy-looking man, viewed as a model of holiness. Jesus continues with a good guy in verse 11. And he says, the Pharisee stood up, which, by the way, was a common posture in that day to pray. Nothing wrong with that part. Prayed about himself, or some translations say to himself. And he prays God, which is really a good way to start off your prayer. He says, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers and evildoers and adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week, which the obligation was only once a week. He went beyond that. That's what he's saying. I've gone beyond the obligation, the duty. And I give a tenth of all I get, which also suggests going beyond what the regular, normal, average person did. Now, it's right here in this prayer that we begin to start to feel a little uneasy. If we were standing there and we heard the Pharisee pray, we might take him aside after the service and coach him a little bit and say something like this. You really should come across a little more modest when you pray. It sounds bad. You sound a little conceited. You really ought to work on that a little bit. Because if there's one thing that sort of bugs us about others, it's conceit. It's one of those sins that we really don't like. I mean, at least in other people. We so easily default to thinking more highly of ourselves than we should. Sometimes we are in need of a little dose of humility. Back many decades ago now, when Christian Herter was governor of Massachusetts, he was running hard for a second term in office. One day, after a busy morning chasing votes and having no lunch, he arrived at a church barbecue. It was late in the afternoon, and Herter was absolutely famished. As Herter moved down through the serving line, he held out his plate to the woman serving chicken, and she put a piece of chicken on his plate and turned to the next person in line. Excuse me, Governor Herter said, do you mind if I have another piece of chicken, a second piece? Sorry, the woman told him, I'm supposed to give one piece of chicken to each person. But I'm starved, the governor said. Sorry, the woman said again, only one to a customer. Well, Governor Herter decided that he would throw a little weight around. He said, do you know who I am? He said, I am the governor of the state. Do you know who I am? The woman said. I'm the lady in charge of the chicken. Move on, mister. Kind of puts things in perspective, doesn't it? Conceit rubs us the wrong way. It's often a symptom of other issues below the surface. And in order to address it, we must call it pride and radically remove the ways we feed it. There's a lot of conceit and pride in the prayer of this Pharisee. In this way, translating that opening phrase in verse 11, prayed to himself, is quite accurate. It's a self-congratulatory prayer that never gets off the ground. He gives lip service to God, but he contemplates himself. Now, in the original, he uses the first person pronoun I 5 times in 2 verses. He uses I 5 times in 2 verses. I mean, it's quite obvious who it is he worships. Now, do you notice the content of his prayer? The Pharisee majors on what he's not doing, obsesses on his legalistic, ritualistic obedience, and he compares himself to others. Pretty much sums up his prayer. I'm not this, I do that, and I'm better than those people over there. That sums it up. And when you pray this way, or you go to church this way, you can leave feeling pretty good about yourself. I mean, isn't there great comfort in reminding ourselves of the sins we haven't committed? I mean, I haven't committed adultery, you might say. I haven't murdered anyone yet. I haven't walked out on my family. I haven't. We focus on that and we just might feel good about ourselves when we leave. And to feel even better, we might start to check off some Christian duties we have accomplished. Went to church, check. Sang songs in service, check. Gave some money in the offering plate, check. Read my Bible this week, check. Said a kind word to a stranger. Check. And Jesus would not give low marks for any of those. You see, the Pharisee did a lot of good things, but for the wrong reasons. What motivated them was the praise of men. And the other matter to consider is how is our ritualistic, extreme discipline and petty rule keeping just a cover up for guilt or something else major that's going on in our lives over here? Again, the problem isn't in the practice of spiritual disciplines, but the motive behind it. We are doing it to show off, or we're doing it to figure because it's a way we gain God's approval, or we're trusting in them for our righteousness, or we do it so that we can feel good about ourselves when we leave, then that's an instant flag that should show up over our hearts and say, check your motives. Something's not right here. And if there isn't enough satisfaction in the sins we haven't committed, there isn't enough satisfaction, the checklist of things we have done in some legalistic way, we can add comparative obedience to our thinking, the third part of this Pharisee's prayer. Now this might be, by the way, just the greatest strategy of self-justification there is. We look around like this Pharisee, and we conclude that we are not like some others. I may be treating my spouse disrespectfully, but at least I'm not like that couple over there. They haven't downright drag out fights. Better than they are. I'm not like so-and-so who drinks like a fish or who spreads lies around the church. I'm not like the one who spent time in jail or that person over there. What is he doing here anyway? For the Pharisee, it was about leaving the temple feeling good about himself. I ask you, do you come to church to feel good? Do we come to feel better about ourselves? Why do you go see your doctor for a checkup? Do you say as you're going into the room, doc, you might as well put that stethoscope away. You're not finding anything. I'm fine. No, you don't need to stop poking around. I'm fine. There are no problems here. I'm not like any of those other patients you'll see today. I saw them sitting in the waiting room. They aren't looking so good. But me? All is good here. You can just tell me I'm fine and I'll be on my way. Why bother going? I mean, you may not want to hear any bad news. I mean, who does? But if he puts his finger on something, I'd rather he tells me what's wrong than I just go home happy. I mean, can we really trust our own assessment of ourselves? Reminds me of a young woman who went to her pastor and said, Pastor, I have a besetting sin and I need your help. I come to church on Sunday and I can't help thinking I'm the prettiest girl in the congregation. I know I shouldn't think this way, but I can't help it. I want you to help me with this besetting sin. And the pastor replied, don't worry about it. In your case, it's not a sin. It's just a horrible mistake. Ouch. Now, okay, the pastor could benefit from a little tack. I get that. Hope you never would get that from me. But this is often the case with our conceit and pride, isn't it? It's really bad judgment. It's a wrong estimation of ourselves. We may leave church feeling good about ourselves and yet far, far away from God. That's the case of this Pharisee, the good guy. How's one made right with God? Well, that brings us to the second guy, one we might call the bad guy. The bad guy. We pick it up in verse 13, Luke 18, verse 13. Jesus says, but the tax collector. And right there, as soon as Jesus said, but the tax collector, he had everyone's attention in mentioning him. This bad guy, by everyone's standards. I mean, he was a crook. People had disgust in that day for tax collectors, for they were in cahoots with the Roman authorities. The Jews at that time were under the oppressive rule of the Romans. And so to be on the team of the Romans was to be disloyal to your own people. Those were tax collectors. I mean, it would be a public disgrace to have a tax collector in your family. So as the story is being set up, there's the Pharisee, a model of religion, and a tax collector, the epitome of wickedness. Now, just to drive the point home a little bit more, if both of these guys wanted to borrow your boat, you would let the Pharisee, but not the tax collector. If both invited you over for dinner on the same day, you'd go to the house of the Pharisee, but not the tax collector. If both of these men were running for office, we would vote for the Pharisee and not the tax collector. If both of these guys wanted to date your daughter or your sister, you'd be pleased to have the Pharisee do it, be with her, but not the tax collector. I think you get the point. But the tax collector. Ooh, not him. Verse 13 continues. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven. He beat his breast and he said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. Now, there are a few observations worth mentioning here about this. The first is the tax collector stood at a distance. He stood at a distance. He's way off on the fringe. He's on the outer edge. He doesn't feel worthy to be in the presence of God. He doesn't even feel worthy to be in the presence of those who are righteous like the Pharisee. So he's going to stand off in the distance away from this Pharisee. He's as far away as possible. He sees himself as wretched. He doesn't sing, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like you. Saved the wretch like me. He's not even at the saving point yet. He just knows he's wretched. Others saw him and other sinners like him as the farthest from God. And so in their eyes, he's standing exactly where he should be standing. The tax collector not only stood at a distance, he also would not even lift his eyes to heaven. Interesting phrase there. He's overwhelmed with guilt. He's filled with shame. He feels the weight of his sin, and it all shows in his posture. I mean, he can't even lift his head. The same thought is expressed, by the way, in the Old Testament, in the time when the people of God were disciplined by God due to their disobedience, and in solidarity with God's people. And Ezra prayed in Ezra 9:6. Ezra prayed this. He says, I am too ashamed and disgraced, my God, to lift up my face to you. And if we are to be made right with God, that's to be the attitude of the heart. It isn't the posture that's to be emulated, but the attitude. This tax collector was very aware of his sin and his condition before a holy God. He knows he's a cheat, corrupt, immoral lawbreaker. He knows it. He feels it. I mean, he could have looked around and all this gone bad as he noticed that he was the only tax collector in that temple that day. If there was some Pharisee in him, he might have prayed, yeah, I'm bad. I'm a sinner, yes, but at least I'm here in the temple. I'm at least better than all the other tax collectors. No hint of that attitude whatsoever. No, he stood at a distance. He looks down in shame and guilt, not up. And it says he beat his chest. He beat his chest. Actually, the tense of the verb is of continuous action. He keeps beating his chest. It's a very interesting phrase. It's a gesture that's used to express the most extreme sorrow, the most extreme anguish and grief. And it was something that only women did in that day, not men. The tax collector was not concerned one bit of what others might think as he beat his chest. Perhaps it wasn't the manliest of behavior, but he couldn't help himself. It's a demonstration of great anguish over his sin. He is crushed, he is broken, he is busted, he's humbled. He understands his own sinfulness. That's why his prayer sounds miles different than the Pharisees' prayer. He simply says, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I can just imagine. I can imagine that the Pharisee's thinking to himself as he hears these words of the tax collector, that's all you got? God, have mercy on me, a sinner? That's it? What is this tax collector asking? Well, it's more than just a general plea for mercy. I'm not going to get into it, all of it, but the choice of words in the original suggests that this is language of atonement. The cry of this man's heart is for the forgiveness of sins. This man saw his sin, and likely there was some blood on the sacrifice, on the altar that he kind of could see out of the corner of his eye. And he saw all that, and he saw his need for forgiveness, and it resulted in his cry out to God for grace and for mercy, simply saying, apply the sacrifice to my life. That's what he's crying out for. The tax collector came humbly, the Pharisee came in pride. How do we come to God? How do we come to God? Jesus ends the story with this punchline in verse 14. He says, I tell you that this man, the tax collector, rather than the other, the Pharisee, went home justified before God. See, we come back to the question mentioned at the outset, how are we made right with God? Because there was one made right with God that day and one who was not. The hearers that day would have gasped in hearing who was made right. If asked prior to this story, if you took a survey of everyone standing there, who is the one made right with God, the Pharisee or the tax collector? They would have said, is this a joke? Of course, the Pharisee. Jesus turns it all on its head and says in that one moment, get this, in that one moment, the extreme sinner is pronounced not guilty without doing any works, without any moral, religious, or spiritual achievements. Instant declaration of justification on the spot. Absurd. How can that be? Because this one man did not trust in his own righteousness and what he could do for God, but he came humbly, broken, trusting in what God could do for him. God declared him righteous, not guilty. That's what justified means. The tax collector had no righteousness, and he knew that, so he looked to God for mercy. See, we're justified only by the righteousness that Christ is for us. The good guy, the bad guy. What about us guys, if you will? Like the Sunday school teacher who, after teaching this story, said, now boys and girls, let's bow our heads and thank God we're not like this Pharisee. I think she missed the point. Oh, but our minds go there, don't they? Glad I'm not like him. I wouldn't do that. Not me. Jesus ends the story by giving this truism, this axiom, this principle, end of verse 14. He says, for everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. I ask you this morning, do you stand where the Pharisees stood? Exalting yourself, it might be subtle, trusting in your own good works and righteousness, taking pride in what you haven't done, or obsessing on legalistic obedience, or comparing yourself to others. Do you stand there this morning? Well, you may go home feeling good about yourself, yet still far away from God, not right with Him. I mean, is your plan to stand before God someday and say, God, I have not done these things over here, and I have done this list of rituals over here, and I'm certainly not like that pathetic individual over there. I mean, you're banking on God looking at the many notes stuffed in your Bible, the years of serving in some ministry or on the soup kitchen or whatever it might be, or what you have done in the name of religion, and you're kind of hoping God's going to say, okay, you know what, you're a good guy, come on in. Is that where you stand today? Be honest about it. Is that where you stand today? Or do you stand where the tax collector stood? I mean, have you ever come to God like this tax collector did? Broken, busted, unworthy, guilt-ridden, filled with shame, head down. You can come to God with your head held low in shame and guilt. And when you come to God that way, what will God do? Picture a child who comes to his or her parent knowing they have done wrong. They come in guilt with their head held down. They're busted. They got caught and they just come in and they know it. The mom or dad just might take a hold of that child's chin and lift the child's head up. Look into his or her eyes and say, I forgive you. God puts his hands on your chin. If you come to him that way, he puts his hands on your chin. He lifts your head. He looks into your eyes and he says, I forgive you. You come proudly, you never experience that. You come humbly and you do. For everyone who exalts himself, it says, will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Or another way we could translate that, will be lifted up. Lifted up. Stand where the tax collector stood. Come with head bowed. Beat your chest in anguish over your sin. How you do it isn't the point. It's all in the attitude. Because all you have this morning are the words of the tax collector. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I have nothing else. The most religious person you know needs God's mercy just as much as the person on Skid Row who comes to Christ for the very first time. The real question is, are you banking on the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, who took your place on the cross for your righteousness, for your forgiveness? My sin, oh, the bliss of this glorious thought, my sin, not in part but the whole, is nailed to the cross, and I bear it no more. Praise the Lord, oh my soul. That's what makes it well with our soul. That's how we can be made right with God. And you can go home merely feeling good about yourself, but there's another way you can go home today. Justified, right with God, declared righteous in God's sight, set free. How are you planning to deal with your guilt? With a dose of feeling better about yourself, or with a radical cleansing of that guilt? See, the issue is a matter of what you are trusting in for your salvation. Are you looking totally away from yourself? Are you looking at and trusting Christ alone for your justification? For God to come along and say, I declare you not guilty. Lift your head and I say, I forgive you. Where are you standing today? Where are you standing today? Where the Pharisees stood or where the tax collector stood? And you know what? You never outgrow your need of forgiveness. Child of God, coming to God in this way is not a one-time thing. You never get to that place where you don't have to cry out to God for mercy. Perhaps you're here this morning and your enjoyment of Christ is just not there as of late. There's not much excitement to your witness, and there's no little joy in worship, and there's no assurance of salvation, and you just feel you're not good at all at being a Christian. Stand where the tax collector stood. Come broken and humble, and please, I beg of you, don't give in to that foolish pride of a Pharisee that compares and checks off. Don't go there. Believer, speaking to you clearly this morning, at this point, we need to watch carefully to what can happen after we are saved. Our Christian being can easily disappear to our Christian doing. Our discipleship can become task-oriented rather than relationship-oriented. Christian service can become more important than our relationship with Christ. So Christian work becomes draining rather than joyful. Watch it. I speak to myself. It's an occupational hazard. Watch it. That the doing of your Christian life doesn't replace the being of your Christian life. Are you contemplating and are you attempting to keep your acceptability with God by what you do? Child of God, do a reality check this morning on a self-righteousness that snuck into your faith. Have you been applauding your own efforts and works done for Him? The late Ronald Reagan told the story of a time when he was governor of California. He had made this speech in Mexico City, and he said this. He said, after I had finished speaking, I sat down to rather unenthusiastic applause, and I was a little embarrassed. The speaker who followed me spoke in Spanish, which I didn't understand, and he was being applauded about every paragraph. To hide my embarrassment, I started clapping before everyone else and longer than anyone else. My ambassador, after a little bit of that, leaned over and he said to me, Governor, I wouldn't do that if I were you. He's interpreting your speech. Have you secretly been applauding yourself? And the privacy of your own thoughts has some self-congratulation kind of snuck in. I'm a pretty good guy. God's fortunate to have me on His team. A good guy went home stuck in self-congratulatory nature of his own religious device. A bad guy, a stinky tax collector, went home believing, set free, having been made right with God. How about us? How about you?